The Adventures of Mark Twain, Part 1. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The lecture will be delivered this afternoon by Mark Twain, a gentleman whose high moral character and unimpeachable integrity are only surpassed by his natural modesty and sweetness of disposition. I refer in these general terms to myself, for I am the party. I was obliged to excuse the chairman from introducing me because he never compliments anybody, and I knew I could do it just as well without forgetting any of the particulars. Besides, you never know what a person's going to say when they introduce you. For example, about 30 years ago, when I was just starting out on the lecture circuit, I was in the mining camp of Red Dog up around Grass Valley. There I was introduced by an old miner who was pressed into service. He tried to get away, but they caught him and pushed him up on the stage. All he said about me was this: I only know two things about this man. One is that he's never been in the penitentiary, and the other is that I can't imagine why not. And so now I play it safe and introduce myself. I had intended to tell only the truth this afternoon, but I may have already misled you. I must now confess to you that Mark Twain is not my real name. My parents, John and Jane Clemens, gave me the name Samuel. I didn't become Mark Twain, as it were, until 1863. I was born in 1835 in Florida, Missouri, that is. I don't remember much about that little village, though, because we moved away from there when I was just 3 years old, to Hannibal on the Mississippi River. Hannibal was a new town when we moved there and growing. In fact, when I was a boy, it became the second largest place in Missouri, the only larger one being St. Louis downriver, which had about 30,000 inhabitants at the time. St. Louis was not only the largest city in Missouri, but the largest city west of the Mississippi. Back in Florida, I had been born prematurely, frail, sickly. When a neighbor lady came visiting soon after I was born, she looked at me in my crib, then turned to my mother and said, "You don't expect to raise that baby, do you?" My mother allowed she would try. Not long ago, I asked my mother, "I suppose that during all that time you were uneasy about me?" "Yes, the whole time," she admitted. "Afraid I wouldn't live?" She seemed to consider for a while and said, "No, afraid you would." It may seem that I did my best to not survive my childhood. I almost drowned 9 times while we lived in Hannibal, mostly in the Mississippi River, but a few times in Bear Creek, too. My mother wasn't overly concerned about it. She said, "People born to hang are safe in the water." Hannibal was a good place to grow up. It certainly was an interesting place, anyway, with many fascinating characters. Most of the events in Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn actually did happen in and around Hannibal, and the characters in those books of mine were people I knew, people I grew up with. Of course, I changed their names. Laura Hawkins became Becky Thatcher. Tom Blankenship became Huckleberry Finn, etc. The town itself became St. Petersburg in those books of mine. But eventually I felt the need to light out on my own. I was ambitious and adventurous, and I didn't seem to be getting anywhere working in newspaper offices around Hannibal as a printer's devil, or apprentice printer, so I decided to go to the Amazon and become a coca magnate. This was back in 1854 when I was 18 years old. You see, I had just read a new U.S. government report, and I had been mightily attracted by what the report had to say about coca. I read that this was a vegetable product with miraculous powers to sustain and nourish life, so nourishing and strength-giving that the natives there would tramp uphill and down all day on a pinch and require no other sustenance. So I made up my mind to go to the headwaters of the Amazon and collect coca and trade in it and make a fortune. I left for New Orleans with this great idea filling my mind. One of the pilots of the Paul Jones on which I had taken passage was a man named Horace Bixby. Little by little, I got acquainted with him, and pretty soon I was doing a lot of steering for him on his daylight watches. When I got to New Orleans, I inquired about ships leaving for the Amazon and discovered that there weren't any, and learned that there probably wouldn't be any during that century. It had not occurred to me to inquire into these particulars before, so there I was. I couldn't go to the Amazon. I had no friends in New Orleans and no money to speak of. So I went to Horace Bixby and asked him to make a pilot out of me. He said he would do it for $500. $100 cash in advance, and then $400 out of my first earnings once I became a licensed pilot and started earning wages. You see, cubs, or apprentice pilots, didn't receive wages, just board, a place to sleep, and food to eat. And that only when we were on the ship. When we were ashore, we were on our own. Had to get odd jobs, such as guarding freight at the levee to keep body and soul together. Anyway, I steered from Bixby up to St. Louis, borrowed the $100 from my sister Familia's husband, and closed the bargain with my new chief. I entered upon the enterprise of learning 1,200 or 1,300 miles of the great Mississippi River with the easy confidence of my time of life. If I had really known what I was about to require of my faculties, I should not have had the courage to begin. I supposed that all a pilot had to do was to keep his boat in the river, and I did not consider that could be much of a trick, since it was so wide. When we left New Orleans, the boat backed out at 4 in the afternoon, and it was our watch until 8. Mr. Bixby straightened her up, plowed her along past the sterns of the other boats that lay at the levee, and then said, "Here, take her. Shape those steamships as close as you'd peel an apple." I took the wheel, and my heartbeat fluttered up into the hundreds, for it seemed to me that we were about to scrape the side off every ship in the line, we were so close. I held my breath and began to claw the boat away from the danger, and I had my own opinion of the pilot who had known no better than to get us into such peril, but I was too wise to express it. In half a minute I had a wide margin of safety intervening between the Paul Jones and the other ships, and within 10 seconds more I was set aside in disgrace, and Mr. Bixby was going into danger again and flaying me alive with abuse of my cowardice. I was stung, but I was obliged to admire the easy manner with which my chief loafed from side to side of his wheel and trimmed the ship so closely that disaster seemed ceaselessly imminent. When he had cooled a little, Mr. Bixby told me that the easy water was close ashore and the current outside, and therefore we must hug the bank upstream to get the benefit of the former and stay well out downstream to take advantage of the latter. In my own mind, I resolved to be a downstream pilot and leave the upstreaming to people dead to prudence. Now and then, Mr. Bixby called my attention to certain things. He said, "This is 6 Mile Point." I assented. It was pleasant enough information, but I could not see the bearing of it. I was not conscious that it was a matter of any interest to me. Another time he said, "This is 9 Mile Point." Later he said, "This is 12 Mile Point." They all looked about alike to me. They were monotonously unpicturesque. I hoped Mr. Bixby would change the subject, but no. He gave me the wheel once or twice, but I had no luck. I either came near chipping off the edge of a sugar plantation, or I yawned too far from shore, and so dropped back into disgrace again and got abused. The watch ended at last, and we took supper and went to bed. At midnight, the glare of a lantern shone in my eyes, and the night watchman said, "Come, turn out." And then he left. I could not understand this extraordinary procedure, so I presently gave up trying to and dozed back off to sleep. Pretty soon the watchman was back again, and this time he was gruff. I was annoyed. I said, "What do you want to come bothering around here in the middle of the night for? Now it's like as not I'll not get to sleep again tonight." The watchman said, "Well, if this ain't good, I'm blessed." The off watch was just turning in, and I heard some brutal laughter from them and such remarks as, "Hello, watchman, ain't the new cub turned out yet? He's delicate likely. Give him some sugar in a rag and send for the chambermaid to sing Rock-a-Bye Baby to him." About this time, Mr. Bixby appeared on the scene. Something like a minute later, I was climbing the pilot house steps with some of my clothes on, the rest in my arms. Mr. Bixby was close behind, commenting. Here was something fresh, this thing of getting up in the middle of the night to go to work. It was a detail in piloting that had never occurred to me at all. I knew that boats ran all night, but somehow I had never happened to reflect that somebody had to get up out of a warm bed to run them. I began to fear that piloting was not quite so romantic as I had imagined it was. There was something very real and work-like about this new phase of it. Eventually, Bixby began to examine me. What's the name of the first point above New Orleans? I was gratified to be able to answer promptly, and I did. I said I didn't know. Don't know? This man had jolted me. I was down at the foot again in a moment, but I had to say just what I had said before. Well, you're a smart one. What's the name of the next point? Once more, I didn't know. Well, this beats anything. Tell me the name of any point or place I told you. I studied a while and decided that I couldn't. Look here, where do you start out from above 12 Mile Point to cross over? I don't know. You don't know, he echoed, mimicking my drawling manner of speech. What do you know? Nothing for certain. By the great Caesar's ghost, I believe you. You're the stupidest dunderhead I ever saw or ever heard of. So help me Moses. The idea of you being a pilot, why, you don't know enough to pilot a cow down a lane. Oh, but his wrath was up. He was a nervous man, and he shuffled from one side of his wheel to the other as if the floor was hot. He would boil a while to himself and then overflow and scald me again. Look here, what do you suppose I told you the names of those points for? I considered a moment, and then the devil of temptation provoked me to say, well, to be entertaining, I thought. I eventually became a good average pilot, got my license, and earned quite a nice living at it for some years. But the long-dreaded event came at last. The war between the states. Commercial traffic on the river ceased. I was out of a job. In an attempt to avoid being pressed into service by either side, I took passage on a boat north back to Hannibal. In fact, the Nebraska was the last passenger ship allowed up the Mississippi from St. Louis until after the war. But I did end up getting involved in the war in a small way for a short while. This is what happened. Missouri was a slave state, but it never seceded from the Union. That being so, the soldiers stationed in Hannibal, and there were many, were Union soldiers, and I had to keep away from them and out of sight if I didn't want to be pressed into service as a pilot on a warship, or I would be a target to get shot at by soldiers and snipers on the riverbanks. Not that I would have minded that so much, but I would rather volunteer than be drafted, and hadn't quite yet made up my mind which side I preferred to die for. Eventually, I did make a choice, and in the earliest summer days of the war, I slipped out of Hannibal one night with a friend to join an army detachment nearby. I was made second lieutenant of a company of 11 men who knew nothing about war. End of part 1.